She stood at the edge of the palace observation deck, staring out at the twin moons of Ethon Prime, knowing that when dawn broke, she would no longer be a princess of the Stellar Empire. She would be cargo. Princess Lyra had heard the whispers for months. In the gilded corridors of the Imperial Palace, behind ornate doors and through delicate comm screens, the court had murmured the word that had now become her sentence. Barren, useless, a broken vessel, a royal without purpose. And now, that whisper had become a decree. She had not cried when they told her. She had stood straight back before the Imperial Medical Council, in her silver ceremonial robes, and listened as 3 physicians in white coats read from data tablets, without once meeting her eyes. Her reproductive biology, they explained in dry, clinical tones, was incompatible with any known stellar male. No genetic sequence could bridge the gap. No treatment had succeeded. She would never carry a child of her own kind. Her mother, the Empress, had not embraced her. She had simply turned away. And so it was decided. Princess Lyra of the Stellar Empire, daughter of the Empress Vera, third in line to the celestial throne, would be given to Earth. The planet Earth was, by the standards of the galaxy, an unremarkable place. It sat in a quiet corner of the Milky Way, its people barely a century into interstellar awareness. The Stellar Empire had made formal contact with Earth 40 years ago, establishing a diplomatic accord that was, in practical terms, a relationship of convenience. Earth offered certain rare mineral compounds found in its deep ocean floors. The Stellar Empire offered technology and protection from the more aggressive civilizations lurking beyond Earth's awareness. What Earth had never offered before was a diplomatic marriage. But when Ambassador Harlan of Earth visited the Imperial Court and mentioned, almost offhandedly, that his government wished to deepen the alliance, the Empress had seen an opportunity. She had a problem, a daughter with no dynastic value, and a solution had presented itself. Lyra would be the gift that sealed the accord. "You are being honored," her mother had told her, voice cool and composed. "You will represent the Empire on Earth. You will be the bridge between worlds." Lyra had said nothing. She had learned long ago that saying nothing was safer than speaking the truth, and the truth was this. She was being thrown away, wrapped in diplomatic language and ceremonial silk, but thrown away nonetheless. She packed 3 trunks. Her handmaid, Soli, a quiet girl with large violet eyes and nimble fingers, had wept while folding Lyra's gowns. Lyra had not allowed herself the same luxury. Instead, she had stood at her chamber window and memorized the skyline of the capital. The soaring crystal spires, the bioluminescent gardens, the great golden dome of the Imperial Senate. She didn't know if she would ever see it again. The transport ship was sleek and impersonal, staffed by Empire crew who were professionally polite and emotionally distant. Lyra sat in her private cabin for the 3-day journey to Earth, reading reports on her tablet about the planet she was being sent to. She read about human culture, human government, human biology. She studied images of Earth cities, chaotic, colorful, wonderfully strange. And she read about the man she was to marry. His name was Jack Mercer. He was 34 years old, a senior diplomat in Earth's Department of Interstellar Relations. His file described him as highly competent, culturally adaptable, and personally recommended by Ambassador Harlan. His photograph showed a man with dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a slightly crooked smile that seemed at odds with the stiffness of his formal collar. Lyra studied his face for a long time. She had no expectation of love. Love was not the currency of imperial arrangements. What she expected, what she had prepared herself for, was tolerance, polite distance, perhaps pity, the kind of careful civility that 2 people practice when they are bound together by politics rather than affection. She told herself that would be enough. She told herself she had survived worse. The ship descended through Earth's atmosphere on a gray morning, cutting through clouds over a landmass called North America. As the transport touched down at a military airfield outside the capital city, Lyra pressed her palm against the cool porthole glass and watched the world come into focus below her. Green. It was so green. Her home world had been silver and blue and gold, beautiful but cold. Earth's colors felt alive in a way she hadn't expected. They brought her down the ramp to a waiting delegation. Cameras, officials, a red carpet on gray tarmac. Ambassador Harlan was there, beaming in his formal suit, and beside him stood Jack Mercer. He was taller than she'd expected. He wore a dark gray jacket and a blue tie, and when she descended the ramp, he stepped forward and offered his hand, not in submission, not in ceremony, but simply as if offering her something he hoped she might want. "Princess Lyra," he said, "welcome to Earth. I hope the journey wasn't too long." She shook his hand. It was warm. "It was fine," she said. "Thank you." And that was how it began. Not with grandeur or promise, but with a handshake and the smell of rain in the air. They drove in a black motorcade to the residence that had been prepared for them, a large, comfortable house on a quiet street in the city, surrounded by unfamiliar trees that rustled in the wind. Jack showed her around himself, without ceremony, pointing out rooms and cupboards in the kitchen with its strange appliances. "The coffee maker is complicated," he admitted. "I'll show you tomorrow. Or we can just order in. Either way." Lyra blinked. She had expected formality. She had expected him to be stiff, constrained by the weight of what their marriage represented. Instead, he seemed almost relaxed, as if having an alien princess move into his house was simply another Tuesday. "Do you not find this strange?" she asked. He considered the question seriously. "A little, but strange isn't the same as bad." He smiled, that crooked, unguarded smile from the photograph. "I thought we could take it slowly. No pressure. Just get to know each other." That night, alone in her new room with its white curtains and the sound of wind and unfamiliar trees, Lyra allowed herself something she hadn't in months. She hoped. There is a particular cruelty in kindness when you have never expected it, when you have armored yourself against coldness and rejection, when you have rehearsed 1,000 ways to endure indifference, and then someone simply hands you a cup of tea and asks if you slept well. The armor does not know what to do. It trembles. It cracks just a little at the joints. That was what Jack Mercer did to Princess Lyra of the Stellar Empire, not with grand gestures or declarations, with small, consistent, unremarkable acts of care that she had no defense against whatsoever. The first week was careful on both sides. They were two people navigating a very strange situation with the best manners they possessed. They ate breakfast at opposite ends of a long table. They said good morning and good night. They asked each other polite questions about their respective worlds. But beneath the politeness, Lyra was watching him, cataloging his behaviors the way she had been trained to catalog diplomatic allies, looking for the angle, the agenda, the moment when the kindness would reveal itself as calculation. It never did. On the fourth morning, she came downstairs to find him in the kitchen, wearing a worn gray sweater, wrestling with the coffee machine he had promised to explain. He turned when he heard her, holding up a cracked mug in triumph. "I did it," he announced. "First try." Well, he glanced at the coffee ground scattered across the counter. First successful attempt. The first two were crimes against the beverage. She looked at the mess. She looked at him. And despite herself, she laughed. Just briefly. A small, startled sound she hadn't planned to make. But he heard it, and his whole face lit up. "There it is," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Then, louder, "Do you take it with anything?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never had it before." He looked genuinely delighted. "You're going to love it, or hate it. 50-50. But either way, it's an experience." She tried it black. It was intensely bitter and slightly wonderful. They began to talk properly that week. Not diplomatically, not the careful exchange of information between representatives of different civilizations, but personally. He told her about growing up in a small town, about how he got into diplomacy, because he'd been terrible at everything else he'd tried. He told it with such self-deprecating warmth that she found herself listening with something dangerously close to fondness. She told him about Ethon Prime, about the crystal spires and the bioluminescent gardens, about her tutors, who had been brilliant and demanding, and her mother, who had been kind in her own way until she hadn't been, about what it felt like to stand before the medical council and hear yourself described in the past tense, as something that had once had value. Jack had gone very still when she told him that. "That's a terrible thing to do to someone," he said. Not gently, firmly, with a quiet anger that was not performed. "It is the way of my people," she said. It shouldn't be the way of anyone, he replied. She had no answer for that. She simply looked at him across the kitchen table with its two mismatched mugs and filed away the fact that he had said it without flinching. The diplomatic duties were light in those first weeks, mostly formal appearances and cultural briefings. And so they had time. They walked in the park near the house. She discovered that Earth had squirrels, which she found baffling and captivating in equal measure. He discovered that she had a near-photographic memory and a dry, precise sense of humor that emerged slowly, like a sun coming out from behind careful clouds. They began watching films together in the evenings. She had questions about everything, about narrative conventions, about human emotional expression, about why certain music made the chest ache. He answered all of them with patience and interest, and sometimes turned them back to her. What do your people do with grief? Is there music on Ethon Prime? Do stellar children play games? No one had ever asked Lyra about herself like that, not as curiosity, not to extract information useful to the state, simply because they wanted to know. It was disorienting. It was wonderful. She began to lower the armor, one plate at a time. The moment she understood something had shifted was a quiet evening in the third week. They were sitting on the back porch after dinner, watching the sunset behind the trees, a habit they had fallen into without planning. And she had said something offhand about the color of the sky, how it reminded her of the evenings on Ethon Prime when the sun caught the crystal spires and turned everything copper. Do you miss it? He asked. She considered the question honestly. I miss what I thought it was, she said. I'm not sure I miss what it actually is. He nodded slowly. Home is complicated like that, he said. Sometimes you leave and realize the place you were homesick for only existed inside you. She looked at him sideways. That is either very wise or very sad. Possibly both, he agreed. She smiled. He smiled. The sun finished setting. 3 weeks became a month. A month became 2. The diplomatic visits to government offices grew more comfortable. Lyra found she enjoyed the work, the careful navigation of relationships and language and intent. She was good at it, better than she'd been given credit for at home, where her role had been ornamental rather than functional. Jack noticed. He began including her in meetings she wasn't officially required to attend. He asked her readouts of people. What did you think of the trade secretary? Did the ambassador seem nervous to you? Her answers were sharp and accurate, and he listened to them. You're wasted as a diplomatic gift, he said one afternoon, reviewing files at the kitchen table. He said it matter-of-factly, not as flattery, but as observation. She felt the words move through her like something warm. I was told I was wasted entirely, she said. He looked up from his files. His brown eyes were direct and serious. They were wrong, he said simply. The armor that remained was thin and fragile now. She wasn't sure she minded. What she was sure was this. She had come to Earth expecting to endure. She had not expected to begin, quietly and entirely against her own planning, to belong. She hadn't wanted to see a doctor, after the Imperial Medical Council and their cold tablets and their careful avoidance of her eyes. The idea of sitting in another clinical white room while someone catalogued her deficiencies was not something Lyra considered with anything other than dread. But 3 months into her life on Earth, she had developed a persistent fatigue, a deep, cellular exhaustion that crept up on her in the afternoons and left her slow and heavy in ways she didn't recognize. Jack hadn't noticed before she'd admitted it, the way he noticed most things, quietly, without announcement. There's a doctor I trust, he'd said, Dr. Elena Ellis. She works in xenobiology at the university. She's the best there is. He'd paused. You don't have to, if you don't want to, but she's not the kind of person who makes people feel like a data set. He'd been right about that, at least. Dr. Ellis was a compact woman in her 50s with silver hair. She kept pinned in a complicated arrangement that seemed to defy physics, and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She had greeted Lyra not with a wide-eyed fascination that most humans showed in her presence, but with a brisk, warm efficiency of someone who found all biology interesting and had no hierarchy among species. Sit, she'd said, gesturing to the chair beside her desk rather than the examination table. Tell me what you're experiencing. In your own words, not the clinical terms. Lyra had told her. Dr. Ellis had listened without interruption, taking careful notes in a small book with a green cover. When Lyra finished, Ellis had sat back and looked at her thoughtfully. "I'm going to run some tests," she said. "Standard ones first, then some specific to your biology. I'll need your medical records from Ethon Prime if you have access." Lyra had access. She transmitted them that evening. 2 days later, Dr. Ellis called her back. The office was different the second time. Quieter, with afternoon light falling through tall windows, and something in the doctor's stillness that Lyra's diplomatic training immediately identified as careful preparation. The kind of stillness that precedes significant news. "Sit down," Ellis said again in the same tone as before, but this time there was a current beneath the practicality. Lyra sat. Dr. Ellis opened her notebook and then set it aside, which meant she knew what she wanted to say without reading it. "I've gone through your stellar medical records," she began, "and I've cross-referenced them with the results of what I ran here." She paused. The Imperial Medical Council was not wrong in their findings, but they were catastrophically incomplete in their interpretation. Lyra kept her face still. "Explain." "Your reproductive biology isn't non-functional," Ellis said. "It has evolved. Your genetic markers, your hormonal architecture, your cellular receptors, they've diverged from the standard stellar template in ways that are genuinely remarkable, in ways that made you incompatible with your own species." She met Lyra's eyes directly, but not with ours. The room was very quiet. "I don't understand," Lyra said, though some deep part of her had already begun to. "Stellar and human genomes share more ancestral sequence than anyone has publicly admitted," Ellis said. "There's a body of unpublished research. I've been part of it for 8 years. That suggests both species descend from a common ancestral population that diverged approximately 2 million years ago. The Empire has suppressed this research. For political reasons, I won't pretend to fully understand." She held Lyra's gaze. "Your particular genetic divergence moves you back toward that common ancestor. You are, in a very literal biological sense, more compatible with humans than with stellar kind." Lyra realized she had been holding her breath. She released it slowly. "Are you telling me," she said carefully, "that I am not barren?" "That is exactly what I'm telling you." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward, disrupting everything. Lyra looked at the afternoon light on the floor for a long time. Then she looked up. "Who else knows this?" "Right now? You and me." Ellis tilted her head. "I assume you'll tell Jack." Lyra absorbed that. "Jack? Of course Jack." The man who had handed her a cracked mug of coffee and listened to her describe being declared useless, and said, quietly and without flinching, they were wrong. "And your research," Lyra said, "the unpublished work. How many people have this data?" "A small team. Scattered. We've been careful." Ellis folded her hands on the desk. "I want to be honest with you about something. This discovery has implications that extend well beyond your personal situation. If it becomes known what you are, what your biology represents, there are forces within both your empire and ours who will want to control what that means. Politicians, military interests, people who would rather frame this as a strategic asset than as a human," she caught herself, "as a person's private life. You're warning me. I'm giving you time, which is the only thing I can give you right now." Ellis paused. "I want to run a few more tests over the next weeks. And I'd like your permission to continue the research, carefully, discreetly. But the rest of this is yours to decide." Lyra nodded. She stood. At the door, she paused. "Dr. Ellis," she said, "thank you for telling me as though it were news I had the right to receive." Ellis looked at her steadily. "You did," she said. "You do." That evening, Lyra found Jack in the kitchen. Where else? Making something on the stove that smelled of spices and warmth. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching it without his knowledge, and felt something she recognized, slowly and with some wonder, as love. It frightened her. It frightened her because she now carried a secret that could reshape the galaxy, and the first person she wanted to tell was the man at the stove who didn't know yet that the woman the Empire had discarded was not broken after all. She cleared her throat. He turned. "Jack," she said, "we need to talk." He turned the stove to low. He gave her his full attention, the way he always did, completely, without reservation. She told him everything. He listened without speaking until she was done. Then he crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her at the table that had become, somehow, the place where all the real things happened between them. "How do you feel?" he asked. Not, "What does this mean?" Not, "What do we do now?" How do you feel? She had to think about it honestly. "Like someone handed back something I was told I'd never have," she said. "And I don't know yet whether to hold it or run from it." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said. She looked at their hands. His warm, hers pale silver in the kitchen light. Two species, a shared ancestor 2 million years old, and something grew between them that no one had planned and everyone would soon want to claim. She turned her hand over and held his. They did not speak about the discovery every day. By unspoken agreement, they gave it space to settle, like a new stone set into a mosaic, allowed to dry before the weight of the full pattern was placed upon it. But something had shifted, not abruptly, not dramatically, but in the way that seasons shift, perceptibly and irresistibly. The kitchen conversations grew longer. The walks in the park grew slower. The evenings on the back porch stretched later into the night, until the stars came out and Lyra would occasionally point to a patch of sky and name what lay in its direction. The Vela system, the Cascade Nebula, the sector where she had grown up. "That one," she said one night, pointing to a faint cluster near the horizon. "Ethon Prime is in that direction, about 63 light years." Jack looked at where she was pointing. "Does it feel closer or farther than you expected?" "From here," she considered. "Farther," she said. "But that's not entirely a bad thing." He turned his head to look at her, and in the dark she could feel the quality of his attention. That particular focus he had, the one that made you feel like the only thing in the room. "I'm glad you're here," he said. Just that, quietly. She had stopped being surprised by his sincerity. She had simply started believing it. They fell in love the way most people do, without a moment they could precisely name. It wasn't a single event. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small things. The way he saved articles he thought would interest her and left them open on the kitchen table. The way she had started anticipating his expressions, could read the set of his jaw when he was frustrated, the slight upward twitch of his mouth when something amused him, the way they had developed a shared vocabulary, certain phrases that meant things only to them, small jokes that had no context outside their particular life. She told him about her childhood on Ethon Prime. Truly told him, not the diplomatic summary, but the real architecture of it. She told him about the garden where she had spent hours as a girl, studying the way the light moved through crystal formations at different times of day. She told him about her father, who had died when she was 12, and who had been the one person in the palace who had treated her mind as something worth cultivating. Jack told her about his mother, who had worked 2 jobs and still managed to show up to every school play he'd ever been in, sitting in the front row with a pride so enormous it had embarrassed him at the time and undone him as a memory. They told each other the real things. This is how love begins, not in grand statements, but in the deliberate handing over the parts of yourself you usually keep in reserve. 6 months after her arrival on Earth, on a rainy Tuesday evening with nothing particular to recommend it, Jack said, "I love you. I don't want you to feel pressured by that, but I thought you should know." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying to find a way to tell you for several weeks." He laughed, a bright, relieved sound. "Weeks? Why didn't you just—" I was composing the appropriate phrasing. "You're an interstellar diplomat. You give speeches." "This was different," she said. "This mattered." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah," he said softly, "it does." They had married in the civil ceremony months earlier, as required by the terms of the diplomatic accord, in a sparse government office with 2 witnesses and polite handshakes. But that rainy Tuesday evening was, in the calendar of their private life together, the real beginning. Dr. Ellis continued her research. Lyra visited the university lab twice a month, sitting in a bright room full of equipment she only partially understood, while Ellis and her small team, 3 graduate students who'd been sworn to academic discretion, analyzed samples and cross-referenced databases. The work was careful and slow and important. The emerging picture was extraordinary. The ancestral genetic link between stellar and human biology was not theoretical, it was documented. The divergence point, Ellis estimated, was approximately 2 million years ago. A population that had once been singular had fractured, one branch evolving into humanity, one into the stellar kind, and both gradually forgetting the common root. But your biology remembers, Ellis told Lyra one afternoon, peering at a holographic display of interlocking genetic sequences. Your particular mutation, whatever caused it, moved you back along the tree, toward the common ancestor. Is this unique to me? Lyra asked. Ellis hesitated. In the documented data, yes. But the Stellar Empire has suppressed genetic research for 3 centuries. There may be others. We simply don't know. The research stayed quiet. The life Lyra and Jack had built stayed quiet. And then, one morning in early autumn, Lyra awoke with a knowledge that was cellular before it was conscious, and lay still in the pale morning light for a long time, letting it settle. She was pregnant. The test confirmed it that afternoon. Dr. Ellis ran them 3 times to be certain. When the 3rd result came back, the room went very quiet, and then Ellis sat down heavily in her chair and pressed her hands together and said, "Well, there it is." Lyra sat across from her in a chair that had become familiar over months of visits, and felt something vast and terrifying and entirely unlike anything she had ever felt before. "It's real," she said. "It's real," Ellis confirmed. "And it is—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Unprecedented. In the documented history of interstellar contact, in every medical database I have access to, there is no recorded case of a stellar human pregnancy. We would be the first. You would be the first." Lyra went home and told Jack. She found him, where else? In the kitchen. She said, "I'm pregnant." He put down what he was holding. He crossed the room. He held her for a very long time without speaking. When he finally stepped back, she saw that his eyes were bright. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Profoundly," she said. "Me too," he said. "Good scared, though. The kind that means something matters." She leaned her forehead against his. Outside, the autumn trees moved in the wind. Something had happened that the galaxy had not planned for. Something that would, soon enough, refuse to stay quiet. They had been careful. They had been quiet. They had trusted a small circle and kept their secret close and told themselves that they had time. They did not have time. The message came at 3 a.m. A stellar frequency, type beam, encrypted to Lyra's personal comm in a cipher only the Imperial Court used. The chime pulled her out of sleep with a cold clarity that told her, before she even read it, that the piece was over. She sat up in the dark. Jack stirred beside her. "What is it?" She was already opening the message. The header was unmistakable. The seal of the imperial household. The double helix of the Royal Genetic Registry stamped in gold. The kind of correspondence that came directly from the palace. It was from her mother. The Empress Vera had never been a woman who used many words. The message was 5 lines. But those 5 lines landed with the weight of a collapsed star. "We know about the child. The child belongs to the Empire. You will return within 30 days, or we will come for you. This is not a request." Jack read it over her shoulder. She felt him go very still. "How did they find out?" he asked. "I don't know." But even as she said it, she was thinking through the possibilities with the cold efficiency of someone raised in a court where information was currency and privacy was illusion. Someone had talked, or someone had been monitoring stellar frequencies for exactly this kind of development, or the Empire had sources within Earth's government that neither of them had known about. It did not matter which. The result was the same. "What do you want to do?" Jack asked. The question was characteristic of him. He went to her choice first. Not, "Here's what we're going to do. Here's what I think." He went to her. "I want to think," she said. Clearly, without fear. They sat in the dark for a while. Then Jack made coffee, the machine that was no longer complicated, that had become part of the rhythm of their life. And they sat at the kitchen table where all real things happened, and they thought. Dr. Ellis was there by 7 a.m, called in from across the city. She arrived with coffee of her own and a look of grim readiness that told Lyra she had already anticipated something like this. "The research is backed up in 5 separate locations," Ellis said immediately. all off-grid. Whatever happens, the data doesn't disappear. That's not what I'm worried about right now, Lyra said. I know, Ella said, but it'll matter later. They were right to be alarmed. Within 48 hours, the first sign appeared. A stellar diplomatic vessel registered a flight path into Earth's atmosphere, not through the standard liaison channels, but through a classified military corridor that bypassed normal interstellar protocol. Earth's Department of Interstellar Relations received a formal communique from the Stellar Empire demanding, in the careful language of diplomacy that still meant demanding, an urgent audience regarding matters of imperial succession and genetic heritage. Jack took the communique to his superiors. The meeting that followed was the worst he had attended in 15 years of diplomatic work. The Stellar Empire is a Tier 1 ally, his director told him flatly. We can't simply refuse them an audience. They're trying to claim my wife and unborn child as imperial property, Jack said. His voice was controlled. The look in his eyes was not. They're framing it as dynastic continuity, the director said, which is not our jurisdiction to adjudicate. It's our jurisdiction when the person in question is a resident of Earth and has rights under Earth law. She's also a citizen of the Stellar Empire. A citizen they exiled, Jack said quietly. A citizen they declared worthless and gave away. They don't get to reclaim her because she became inconvenient to their narrative. The director looked at him for a long moment. I'll buy you time, he said, but I can't promise more than that. Time was what they had, just not enough of it. The stellar delegation arrived on a gray Thursday morning. 4 officials in imperial white, led by a woman named Counselor Driva whom Lyra had known from court. Driva was impeccable, unreadable, and ruthless in the specific way that imperial counselors are trained to be, not cruelly, but absolutely. The meeting took place at the diplomatic residence. Lyra insisted on being present. Jack sat beside her. Ellis waited in an anteroom. The Empress is prepared to offer generous terms, Driva began. Princess Lyra will be welcomed back to Ethon Prime with full restoration of her titles and privileges. The child will be recognized as the first of a new imperial lineage, a bridge, as the Empress has said, between our peoples. The Empress called me worthless, Lyra said. She said I had nothing to offer the Empire. Circumstances change, Driva said without apology. People don't stop existing in the interval between when you need them and when you don't. Driva's expression did not flicker. The child is of stellar blood, Your Highness. The genetic lineage. The child is mine, Lyra said, and it is Jack's. It will grow up here, on this planet, in this house, with its parents. That is not a negotiating position. It is a fact. There was a silence that had weight to it. The Empress will not accept this, Driva said finally. Then the Empress will have to live with that, Lyra said. When the delegation left, Jack reached over and took her hand without a word. She held it tightly, and beneath the steadiness she was performing, she was aware of something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but something of both. The recognition that the fight had only just begun. Her mother had said 30 days. They were 27 days in. She would not go back. But the Empire was not accustomed to being told no by someone it had already discarded. And discarded things, when they proved more valuable than expected, become targets. She looked out at the garden. The trees were turning gold and red with the earth autumn. In another season, there would be a child. She was not going to let anyone take that from her. She had been cast aside once by the Stellar Empire. She had stood in a gleaming hall and heard herself described in the past tense, and she had survived it by pulling herself inward, making herself smaller, deciding that if she had no value to them, she would simply take up less space. She was not that princess anymore. In the weeks that followed Counselor Driva's visit, Lyra made decisions with a clarity that surprised even herself. It was as if the Empire's attempt to reclaim what it had thrown away had burned off the last of the careful, accommodating distance she had maintained for her own life. This was her life, her child, her family, and she was done being quiet about it. I want to go public, she told Jack on a Saturday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the overnight diplomatic reports. The research, my story, the Empire's suppression of the genetic data. All of it. He looked at her steadily. That's a big thing. Yes, she said. It's time for a big thing. Dr. Ellis agreed immediately. She had been waiting, with the patience of scientists accustomed to slow processes, for exactly this moment. "The data is ready," she said. "It's been ready. I just needed to know you were." What followed was 3 weeks of careful, meticulous preparation. Ellis compiled the research into a form that could be understood by both scientific communities, stellar and human alike. Jack worked with Earth's Department of Interstellar Relations to ensure that the announcement would be protected by diplomatic protocols, that Lyra could not be seized or coerced, that Earth's government would stand behind her. Not everyone in that government was willing. There were those who wanted to negotiate with the Empire, to find some middle path that preserved the alliance without antagonizing the stellar crown. Jack had those arguments, again and again, in offices and conference rooms, and he made the same point each time with the quiet persistence that was his greatest diplomatic skill. The alliance was worth nothing if it required them to trade a person's rights for it. In the end, they had enough. They had Earth's foreign secretary and 3 senior senators and an international press platform and university auditorium, and they had each other. And they had a child who was making itself known in small, definitive ways, a flutter, a presence, a person becoming. The announcement was made on a December morning, with pale winter light coming through the tall windows of the university auditorium where Lyra had sat so many times in Ellis's laboratory. There were cameras and journalists and a live transmission on the Interstellar Communication Network that reached not only every corner of Earth, but every stellar installation with a receiver. Lyra stood at a podium. She had written the speech herself, not in the formal, elevated diction of imperial court addresses, and not in the careful neutral language of diplomatic communiques. She wrote it in her own voice, the one she had found slowly over the past year in a kitchen on a quiet street surrounded by trees she hadn't known the names of when she arrived. "I was sent to Earth as a gift," she said, "because my own people had decided I had no value. They declared me broken, useless, unworthy of the lineage I had been born into. They sent me away not with cruelty, but with something worse, the casual certainty that they were right." She paused. The room was very quiet. They were wrong. What they called brokenness was difference. What they called incompatibility was evolution. My biology had diverged, not into failure, but into something new, something that no one had thought to look for, because no one believed it was possible. She told them about Dr. Ellis and the research. She told them about the shared ancestry, the common root that the stellar empire had suppressed for 3 centuries because it complicated the story they preferred about themselves. She told them what that research meant, not as a political weapon, not as a strategic asset, but as knowledge, as truth, as the kind of truth that people deserve to have about who they are and where they come from. She told them about her child. "In a few months," she said, "my husband and I will have a daughter. She will be the first human stellar child ever documented. She will be, in the most literal biological sense, the bridge between 2 peoples who share more history than either has admitted. She will be new. She will be unprecedented. And she will be ours, not the Empire's, not a symbol, not a political instrument. She will be our daughter, and she will grow up knowing exactly who she is." She looked into the cameras. Somewhere beyond the cameras, across 63 light years of space, she was looking at her mother. "I was told I was worthless because I could not serve a dynasty. But I was never asked what I could be if given the freedom to simply exist. I know now. I am the bridge, not because the Empire made me one, because I chose to be." The response was seismic. On Earth, the announcement ignited a wave of public feeling that swept through media and government and ordinary people alike. The idea that humanity and the stellar empire shared common ancestors, suppressed for centuries by imperial politics, was revelatory. Scientists demanded access to the research. Politicians debated its implications. Ordinary people, human, and the stellar expatriates living on Earth wrote to the diplomatic residence in numbers that overwhelmed the inbox and had to be rerouted through 3 separate servers. On Ethon Prime, the initial response from the Imperial Court was silence, the silence of an institution absorbing a shock. Counselor Dreva sent no further communiques. The stellar military vessel that had loitered in Earth's upper atmosphere for 3 weeks quietly departed. Then, 10 days after the announcement, a private message arrived on the Imperial cipher. Not 5 lines this time. longer, and different in tone than anything the Empress had ever sent her daughter before. Lyra read it alone. Then she folded the message, metaphorically, on her comm screen and sat for a long time in the kitchen with cold coffee. Jack found her there. "From her?" he asked, seeing her expression. "From her," Lyra confirmed. "Good news or bad news?" Lyra thought about it. "Neither," she said. "It's a beginning." She paused. "She says the Genetic Research Suppression Act is being reviewed. She says there are scholars who have wanted to publish for decades and have been prevented." Another pause. "She says she is—" Lyra's voice caught slightly, "that she regrets the decisions made in haste." Jack sat down across from her. "Is that an apology?" "For my mother? It's the closest thing." She looked up. "It's not enough, and it's not nothing. And I don't know yet what it means for the future." "You don't have to know today," he said. She looked at him. This man who had handed her a cup of coffee on a gray morning at the bottom of a ramp, who had given her his full attention and meant it, who had said they were wrong in a quiet kitchen voice that she had carried with her ever since. "No," she agreed. "I don't have to know today." Their daughter was born in the spring, when the trees outside the house were green again, and the world was full of particular sharp sweetness that comes after a long winter. She was small and loud and entirely herself, with silver-pale skin and dark eyes that would shift color as she grew, and she curled her small hand around Lyra's finger with the absolute conviction of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. They named her Eva. Dr. Ellis held her in the delivery room and cried without apology. Jack sat beside Lyra's bed holding both their hands, mother and daughter both, with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that Lyra had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much. She looked instead at her daughter, at the first of her kind, at a child who would grow up between worlds, belonging entirely to both, a living proof that what you're told you cannot have is not always the truth of what is possible. Outside, the spring was warm and ordinary and full of light. She was not worthless. She never had been. She was a bridge between worlds. And now, she was also simply a mother holding her daughter in a house on earth, where the trees she had not known the names of when she arrived were blooming gold in the morning sun. It was, she thought, exactly enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.